I, 28F, recently had to make a difficult decision regarding my stepmother Dorothy, 45F, and her daughter Estella, 19F. This is a long story with a lot of background, so please bear with me. My mother passed away from cancer when I was 15. She fought the disease for 2 years, and those were the hardest years of my life. I watched my vibrant, loving mother slowly fade away while my father and I tried to keep our family together. After she passed, my father fell into a deep depression. He started drinking heavily and barely kept his job. I basically had to grow up overnight, taking care of both myself and him. Things started to improve when my father met Dorothy at a work conference when I was 17. She was newly divorced with a 9-year-old daughter, Estella. Dorothy seemed to bring my father back to life. He stopped drinking, started taking care of himself again, and for the first time since my mother's death, I saw him smile genuinely. They dated for about 6 months before getting married. It was quick, but I was just happy to see my father healing. Dorothy and Estella moved into our family home right after the wedding. Initially, everything seemed fine. Dorothy was nice to me, though sometimes a bit too eager to step into a maternal role. I made it clear from the start that while I respected her as my father's wife, she wasn't replacing my mom. She seemed to understand and backed off a bit. Estella was a sweet kid who followed me around like a puppy, which was cute at first. I moved out for college shortly after they moved in, but I came home regularly to visit. The house started changing gradually, new furniture, different paint colors, rearranged rooms. I understood that Dorothy wanted to make the space her own, but she always consulted with my father and me before making any major changes, which I appreciated. The dynamic shifted when I was in my junior year of college. Dorothy suggested we have a garage sale to clear out some old stuff. She said the house needed decluttering, and my father agreed. I came home to help sort through things. During this process, I noticed some of my mother's belongings were missing, small things at first, like her favorite coffee mug and some books. When I asked about them, Dorothy said they must have gotten mixed up with the garage sale items accidentally. Then came the big move 5 years ago. My father got a promotion that required renovating his home office, which meant clearing out a lot of storage space. Dorothy took charge of the reorganization. After the renovation, I couldn't find many of my mother's things, her clothes, jewelry, photo albums, and personal items. Dorothy told me and my father that during the chaos of moving things around, several boxes were accidentally sent to donation centers. She acted devastated, saying she had tried to track them down but couldn't. I was heartbroken. These weren't just random possessions, they were my last tangible connections to my mother. Her wedding dress that I dreamed of wearing someday. The handwritten recipe book filled with family secrets passed down through generations. The pearl necklace my grandfather gave her on her 16th birthday. The photo albums documenting my childhood. Dorothy apologized profusely, and my father, though sad, told me we needed to accept it and move forward. Life went on, but I never fully got over losing those items. Every time I visited home, I felt like my mother's presence was being slowly erased. Dorothy redecorated my mother's garden, painted over the growth chart marks on the kitchen wall, and replaced all the family photos with new ones of her, my father, and Estella. Still, I kept quiet because my father seemed happy. Last month, everything changed when my father had a severe heart attack. He collapsed at work and was rushed to the hospital. As his only child and next of kin, I took emergency leave from work to handle his affairs while he was in intensive care. The doctor said he needed surgery and would be hospitalized for at least a few weeks. While organizing his paperwork at the house, I needed to find some old insurance documents that my father said were stored in the attic. I hadn't been up there in years, it was mostly used for holiday decorations and old furniture. As I was searching through boxes, I noticed something odd behind a stack of old moving boxes, several large black garbage bags. I opened one bag and felt my world stop. Inside were my mother's clothes, still on their hangers, including her wedding dress. Another bag contained photo albums. A third had her jewelry box, still full of family heirlooms. Everything that was supposedly lost during the move was there, stuffed into garbage bags and hidden away like trash. I spent hours going through those bags, crying as I rediscovered pieces of my mother's life that I thought were gone forever. But as my shock wore off, anger took its place. Dorothy had lied to us. She deliberately hid these things, watching me grieve their loss for years without saying a word. I drove to the hospital, where Dorothy was staying with my father. I asked to speak with her privately in the hallway. When I confronted her about the bags, she first tried to act confused. But when I showed her photos I'd taken of the bags and their contents, her demeanor changed completely. She started crying, saying she never meant to hurt me. She claimed she felt threatened by my mother's continued presence in the house. She said it was hard for her to live in another woman's space, seeing her things everywhere. She also mentioned that Estella had told her it felt weird having a dead woman's stuff around. So during the renovation, they packed everything away, planning to deal with it later. I was livid. These weren't her things to hide. She had no right to decide what happened to my mother's belongings. When I reminded her how devastated I'd been thinking these items were lost, she got defensive. She said she was just trying to make the house feel like her home too, and that I was being unfair for not considering her feelings. That's when I told her she needed to leave my father's house immediately. She started crying harder, saying she had nowhere to go on such short notice. Estella, who had been sitting with my father, came out to see what was happening. When I told her I knew what they'd done with my mother's things, she turned pale. Dorothy tried to argue that she couldn't leave while my father was in the hospital, that he needed her. I reminded her that the house was still solely in my father's name, and as his power of attorney while he was incapacitated, I had the authority to make this decision. I gave them 3 days to pack their essential items and find temporary accommodation. Estella burst into tears, calling me cruel and heartless. She said they'd been family for 10 years and I was throwing them out over old stuff. Dorothy's sister called me that evening, berating me for making them leave with such short notice and saying I was using my temporary power of attorney to act out old grudges. I stood firm. I helped them pack some clothes and personal items, then changed the locks after they left. I've moved back into the house temporarily to care for my father when he's released from the hospital. I haven't told him what happened yet. The doctors say he needs to avoid stress during his recovery. Some family members think I overreacted and should have waited until my father recovered to make such a big decision. They say I'm being vindictive and that Dorothy's actions, while wrong, don't justify making her and Estella homeless. But I couldn't bear the thought of them continuing to live in the house after discovering their deception. Those bags in the attic proved they never really saw this as my family home. To them, we were just occupying space that they wanted to claim as their own. Update 1: The situation has become significantly more complicated since my last post. My father was released from the hospital last week, and I had no choice but to tell him everything that happened. His reaction wasn't at all what I expected, and new information has come to light that makes this whole situation even messier. When I picked him up from the hospital, I wanted to wait until he was settled at home before having the conversation. But Dorothy had already sent him multiple texts about being kicked out, so I had to explain everything right away. I showed him the garbage bags with my mother's belongings and explained how I found them in the attic. My father was initially shocked when he saw my mother's things. He sat there for a long time, holding my mother's wedding dress, not saying anything. I thought he understood why I had asked Dorothy and Estella to leave. But then he started defending Dorothy's actions. He said while what she did was wrong, I had absolutely no right to kick her out of their home. According to him, I should have waited to discuss it as a family. Then he dropped several bombshells that completely blindsided me. First, he revealed that Dorothy had been managing their finances for the past few years. Apparently, she used her own money to pay for house maintenance, property taxes, and even helped pay off a second mortgage I didn't know existed. He said she had invested a lot in making this house their home. But the biggest shock came when he told me that 2 years ago, he had secretly added Dorothy to the house deed as a joint owner. He did this without telling me because he knew I would be upset about it. This means I had no legal right to evict her, even with my power of attorney. Dorothy's lawyer contacted me yesterday with documents proving her ownership and demanding she be allowed to return immediately. While trying to process this revelation, I discovered something even worse. I had been going through the house more thoroughly, trying to determine if anything else had been hidden away. In my father's home office, I found a locked filing cabinet. Using the spare key from his keyring, I opened it and found evidence that Dorothy had been systematically selling some of my mother's jewelry over the years. There were receipts from various pawn shops dating back 3 years. Some pieces I recognized from my mother's jewelry box, pieces that had been in our family for generations. The pearl necklace from my grandfather, my grandmother's emerald earrings, and even my mother's engagement ring. All sold off without anyone's knowledge. When I confronted Dorothy about this over the phone, she became defensive. She claimed she used the money for necessary house repairs and to start a college fund for Estella. My father seemed to believe her explanation, but something didn't add up. I went through old bank statements and found large transfers to Dorothy's personal account that coincided with the dates on the pawn shop receipts. The amounts transferred were always slightly less than the value shown on the receipts, suggesting she kept most of the money for herself. My father is now staying with Dorothy at her sister's house. He says he refuses to return home until I apologize to both Dorothy and Estella for my hasty and cruel actions. He claims the stress of this situation is affecting his recovery, which makes me feel guilty, but I can't bring myself to apologize when I know what they did. Dorothy's sister has been calling me daily, saying I'm tearing the family apart. Several of my father's siblings have also gotten involved, pressuring me to make amends. They keep saying my father needs a stress-free environment to recover, and that my stubbornness is putting his health at risk. Some have even suggested that Dorothy should press charges against me for illegally evicting her. I consulted a lawyer who confirmed I had no legal right to evict Dorothy since she's on the house deed. He said she could sue me for the eviction if she wanted to. However, he's helping me build a case regarding the stolen jewelry. We have documentation proving these were my mother's possessions, and selling them without my father's knowledge could be considered theft. Dorothy's lawyer sent a threatening letter warning that if I pursue any legal action regarding the jewelry, they will countersue for harassment and emotional distress. They claim Dorothy has evidence that I've been hostile toward her throughout their marriage and that kicking her out was the culmination of years of targeted behavior. My father called last night, asking me to drop everything and move back to my apartment. He wants Dorothy and Estella to return to the house so things can go back to normal. When I brought up the jewelry, he got angry and said I was being materialistic and that they were just things. He doesn't seem to understand that it's not about the monetary value, it's about Dorothy secretly selling off pieces of my family history. I'm standing firm in my decision not to apologize, but I'm worried about my father's health and how this stress might affect his recovery. His doctor called to tell me his blood pressure has been elevated, and he blames it on this situation. Part of me wonders if I should just give in for his sake, but another part feels like that would be betraying my mother's memory all over again. Update 2: The situation has taken an unexpected turn. Estella contacted me privately last week, completely changing everything I thought I knew about Dorothy. I'm still processing all the new information, but I'll try to explain everything that's happened. It started with a text from Estella asking if we could meet somewhere private. She seemed nervous and didn't want Dorothy to know about our meeting. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop far from both our usual neighborhoods. When Estella arrived, she was a mess. She hadn't been sleeping well, and it showed. She broke down almost immediately, saying she couldn't keep quiet anymore about what she knew. According to Estella, Dorothy had been planning something behind everyone's backs for months. Dorothy had been meeting with realtors secretly, trying to convince my father to sell the house and move to a smaller place. Estella overheard several phone conversations where Dorothy discussed potential listings and property values. But here's the real kicker: Dorothy wasn't planning this move for the reason she told my father. Estella showed me screenshots of text messages between Dorothy and various debt collectors. It turns out Dorothy has a serious gambling problem that she's kept hidden from everyone. She's been frequenting local casinos for years, racking up massive debts. The messages showed she owed money to multiple creditors, and they were getting increasingly aggressive about collection. The truth about my mother's jewelry also came out. Estella admitted that Dorothy hadn't used the money for house repairs or her college fund as she claimed. The money went straight to paying off gambling debts. Every time the creditors would threaten legal action, another piece of jewelry would mysteriously disappear. Estella was crying as she showed me more evidence: bank statements showing regular large withdrawals at local casinos, hidden credit card statements with massive cash advances, and even photos Dorothy took of my mother's jewelry before selling it, which she'd send to potential buyers. What really got to me was when Estella explained why she finally decided to come forward. She discovered that the college fund Dorothy claimed to have set up for her didn't exist. Every penny that was supposed to go toward Estella's education had been gambled away. Estella found this out when she tried to register for her next semester and realized no payments had been made. I took all this information to my father. At first, he was reluctant to even look at it. He kept saying I was just trying to turn him against Dorothy. But when I showed him the evidence Estella provided, especially the bank statements showing regular withdrawals at casinos matching the dates of the jewelry sales, something finally clicked. My father spent hours going through everything. He called the bank and discovered Dorothy had opened several credit cards in their joint names that he knew nothing about. She had maxed them all out, taking cash advances for gambling. The total debt was staggering. When confronted with all this evidence, Dorothy didn't even try to deny it anymore. Instead, she turned on Estella, calling her a traitor and ungrateful. She threatened to cut Estella off completely, saying she'd make sure Estella never finished college. The way she turned on her own daughter so quickly was chilling. My father has finally moved back home and started divorce proceedings. Dorothy is fighting it hard, claiming she's entitled to half of everything, including the house. Her lawyer argues that since she's on the deed and contributed to household expenses, she has equal claim to all assets. Estella has moved in with us temporarily. She's been struggling with guilt, both about her role in hiding my mother's belongings and for not coming forward sooner about Dorothy's gambling. She explained that when she was 9, Dorothy told her they needed to hide my mother's things because they were making my father sad. Estella believed her mother was trying to help. By the time she realized the truth, she felt it was too late to say anything. The hardest part for Estella has been accepting that her mother's loving persona was largely an act. Dorothy presented herself as the perfect wife and mother to the outside world, but behind closed doors, she was manipulative and deceitful. Estella shared stories about how Dorothy would guilt-trip her into keeping secrets, always using emotional manipulation to maintain control. Update 3: The final chapter of this saga has come to a close, and I wanted to share how everything turned out. These past months have been a roller coaster, but things are finally settling into a new normal. The divorce proceedings are well underway, and my father's lawyer has built a strong case regarding Dorothy's financial deceptions. They discovered even more unauthorized credit cards and loans than we initially thought. Dorothy had apparently been taking out cash advances and personal loans using the house as collateral without my father's knowledge. The total debt was nearly twice what we originally estimated. Dorothy made one last desperate attempt to reconcile with my father 2 weeks ago. She showed up at our house unannounced late one evening, crying and begging for forgiveness. She claimed she was getting help for her gambling addiction and had joined a support group. When my father didn't immediately respond to her pleas, her attitude completely changed. She started threatening to tell everyone about my father's past drinking problems. She said she'd make sure his company knew about how bad things got after my mother died, implying it would ruin his career. I recorded this entire conversation on my phone and sent it straight to our lawyer. Her attempted blackmail only strengthened our case against her. Estella has permanently cut ties with her mother after discovering even more lies. Not only had Dorothy emptied Estella's supposed college fund, but she'd also taken out student loans in Estella's name without her knowledge. Estella found this out when she started receiving collection notices for loans she never knew existed. We're working with authorities to prove these loans were taken out fraudulently. We've had some success tracking down my mother's jewelry. Several pieces were recovered from local pawn shops, including my grandmother's emerald earrings. The shops were cooperative once our lawyer got involved, providing documentation of all transactions with Dorothy. However, many pieces had already been sold to private buyers and are likely lost forever. The remaining items are now stored in a safe deposit box at my bank. My father and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. He finally apologized for not seeing Dorothy's true nature sooner and for doubting my judgment when I first found my mother's things. He admitted that he was so afraid of being alone after my mother died that he ignored red flags about Dorothy from the beginning. Dorothy's sister and other flying monkeys still try to contact us regularly. They claim Dorothy is the real victim here, that her gambling was caused by the stress of living in a house haunted by my mother's memory. Some even suggested that my mother's illness and death somehow traumatized Dorothy, trying to excuse her actions. We've blocked them all on every platform. Estella is staying with us while she figures out her next steps. She's working part-time and taking online classes while we sort out the mess with her student loans. Despite everything Dorothy did, Estella still sometimes struggles with guilt over exposing her mother's secrets. We're helping her understand that she did the right thing. The house feels different now. We've brought my mother's things down from the attic, and some of her photos are back on the walls. My father and I spend evenings going through her recipe book, trying to recreate the dishes she used to make. It's bittersweet, but it feels like we're finally healing. Some relatives still think I was too harsh in my initial reaction to finding my mother's belongings hidden away. They say I should have been more understanding of Dorothy's feelings about living in another woman's house. But I don't regret exposing the truth. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. Dorothy's final hearing is next month. Her lawyer is still pushing for half of everything in the divorce, but our evidence of her financial deceptions and fraud should prevent that. Either way, we're ready to close this chapter of our lives and move forward without her.